All right, everybody, welcome to our class on the truth about Israel, Unmasking the Lies. And so we have been in this class now for 4 weeks. We have 1 week left next week, and then we'll wrap it up before we take our Christmas break. And when we return in January, on January 10th, there will be several different classes that will be starting up. Then one of them will be the class that I teach on how to read, study, and interpret the Bible. Which is a favorite of mine, to teach people, how to actually interpret the Bible, how to get the most out of their Bible reading, how to understand all that stuff. And we actually talk about in that course, we start off talking about the question that a lot of people get confused by. How did the New Testament, how did the Bible come into being? How did these guys decide which books to put in the New Testament and which books not to put in the New Testament, right? Because that's always the big complaint about people in the world. Well, I can't trust the Bible. These guys just sat around. They decided indiscriminately, and what about the book of this, and what about the book of that? And so I talk about that in the first class. We talk about, before you start interpreting the Bible, you got to know how the Bible was put together. You need to know the types of literature. You need to, so we'll talk about, why can we trust our Bible? Can we trust our Bible? Of course we can trust our Bible, but you need to be able to answer those questions for people when they're telling you about, the book of Thomas, they didn't put it in the book of this and the book of, and of course the movie, if you've ever seen it, The Da Vinci Code, kind of kicked off a lot of that stuff, because it's a fictitious story of some lost material and things like that. It's a fabulous movie. It's a great story, but it's not biblical or true at all, right? So it's just what it is. It's fantasy, all right? And so anyway, that's the class that will start on January 10th. But tonight, what I want to do is I want to start off with a video in just a moment. And there was a video that I promised that I would show you last week when we were talking about the people in Gaza. We were talking about how they feel about Hamas. And one of the things that you need to know is that a lot of the people that are living in Hamas that are living in Gaza hate Hamas because Hamas has killed their relatives, because Hamas rules with an iron fist, because they have no say. If they complain at all, if they say they don't like anything, Hamas just kills those people. Because remember, there's no value to life with Hamas, all right, or any of those terrorist groups. And so they even kill their own people. So we already talked about the fact that when they hijacked the election of 2006, killed off all their enemies basically, hijacked the election, and they've never had an election since and became dictators. That the first thing they did was everyone that was against them, they went out and killed. Those people were Palestinians. They killed their own people, all right? And so I want to show you this animated video. It's about 3 minutes long. That was produced by some people inside Gaza. And as I said last week, the reason it's animated is so their identities don't get exposed. But I think you'll find this video very, very interesting because it's about what's happening there. And so here is their story. It's called Whispers in Gaza.
هم دخلوا علينا ب 2007 بكلمة إصلاح والتغيير. وما دخلوا علينا بالإصلاح والتغيير، هم بالنهب، بالسرقة، بالذل، بالمهانة، بالواسطة، بقلة فلوس، بانعدام فلوس العمل. إيش ضل تعمل حكومة عشان تنهك، تتعب وتنهب الشعب أكتر من هيك؟ إحنا بطلنا عارفين. ما فيش أي مشروع صغير حتى لو كشك دخان أو مشاريب ساخنة أو باردة إلا وحاطة إيدها فيه، إلا بدها تاخد منه. حتى على الكورنيش مثلا في غزة كتير فتح كافيهات ومطاعم، لكن بالمقابل تاخد منهم ضرائب كبيرة جدا. فأنت لما تروح هناك حتى المكان اللي كان مجاني، المكان البحر، نروح نقعد نشرب قهوة. القهوة كانت مثلا بشيكل، هلقيت صارت لما بتروحي بتلاقيش مكان مجاني، لازم تقعدين في كافي أو في مطعم. صارت لقيت القهوة ب3 شيكل وأكتر. صار الاشي بغلوه عليه على صاحب الكافي، صاحب المطعم، بيغلى علينا احنا. يعني بيتاجروا فينا باسم حاجة المقاومة. احنا كنا زمان ايام الانتفاضة الاولى والانتفاضة الثانية كنا نقاوم، كنا نآمن في حاجة اسمها مقاومة، انه بدنا نطرد المحتل. كان بيقول مقاومة خالصة بنسكت بدنا نحرر بلدنا، بدنا نحرر دولتنا. لكن لقيت حتى الشعب بطل يآمن في المقاومة، لقيت المقاومة صارت تجارة. موضوع الحروب اللي صارت في غزة من 2008 و2012 و2014 و2020 هذه كلها ربح، اللي بياكلها بس الشعب، الناس اللي بنضربوا الشعب، اللي بيأذوا بس الشعب. كل ما صار حرب، كل ما دخلت مساعدات أكثر، كل ما هم استفادوا أكثر، وإحنا لما نستفيد أي حاجة. هم بيكونوا في يعني محصنين في المخابئ تاعتهم، إحنا اللي بناكلها إحنا الشعب. وفي الآخر بقول لك إيش؟ انتصار. وين الانتصار لما معظم أبراج غزة نزلت؟ طب وين الانتصار لما كثير ناس فقدوا فرص العمل تاعتهم؟ وين الانتصار لما معظم أو قول ثلث شعب غزة راحوا بيوتهم؟ وين الانتصار؟ وإحنا حاليا عايشين من قتل الموت يعني.
So kind of an interesting take, isn't it? That video really speaks to what's going on there today, doesn't it? And how a lot of the people that are in Gaza feel about Hamas, and how they come in and they steal from their businesses, and they're like mafia, right? And so I wanted to share that with you. I wanted you to be able to see that, to hear from one of the people that's inside of Gaza. That represents a whole group of people in there, and they put together that little short animated video to kind of let people know what really goes on in there and how they really feel about things. Well, tonight, I want to move to talking about, before I get into what I want to talk about tonight, which we're going to talk about the Holocaust and the Shoah, I want to just share with you very quickly 10 interesting facts about Israel that you may not know, all right? 10 facts that you may not know. This is kind of a fun thing. Number one is this. The Jewish flag colors are blue and white, and they're blue and white to mimic the tallit. So the tallit is the Jewish prayer shawl that Jewish men wear, okay? So the flag is actually a representation of their prayer shawl. The second thing is that every Jew is required to serve in the Israeli Defense Force for 2 years upon graduating high school. Did most of you know that? That everyone in Israel serves, men and women. Kind of interesting. A lot of people don't understand. Third thing is the national emblem in Israel is the menorah. Okay, what story does the menorah come out of? What is today, right now, this is the first day of what? What are Jews celebrating today? Hanukkah, yes, so you see the menorah in Hanukkah, okay? So the national emblem of Israel is the menorah. Next fact is Israel's population stands at approximately 9.73 million. Jews make up the majority at 73.5%, or about 7.145 million people. The Arab community accounts for 21%, around 2 million people. So again, we've talked about some of these things of how Israel treats the Arabs and that are in their land, that they have full rights, full citizenship. They sit in the Knesset, which is their parliament. They have sat on the Israeli Supreme Court. So you can see 9.7 million Jews, 2 million Arabs. So there are a lot of Arabs that are Israelis, that are Israeli citizens, okay? And most people are kind of shocked to hear that. The next one is this. I may have gotten ahead there. 43% of the Jews in the world now live in Israel. Okay, so that number continues to grow. So think of what it was 70 years ago after the Holocaust, where there were Jews that were living in the land of Palestine, and now you know what that means, right? When we talk about the land of Palestine, but nowhere near the numbers today. So 43% of the Jews on the planet now live in Israel. As of 2023, there are 240,000 Holocaust survivors left worldwide. Now, this is what's fascinating. 167,000 of them are living in Israel. 167,000 of them. Now, here's what you need to know about a lot of the Holocaust survivors. Many of them had their lives destroyed, and now as elderly people, they are very poor. So one of the things Bishop Robert Stern's ministry, Eagle's Wings, does is they have 2 feeding centers in Israel. And one of them's in Jerusalem, and it's called Abraham's Bread. And their largest clientele coming in for meals as Holocaust survivors. So if you can imagine having gone through all of that, and then you find out that the UN gives you your own land, right? And so they come from Germany, they come from the concentration camps in Poland and wherever, and they make their way to Israel. And 20 minutes after Israel becomes a nation, now they're at war again because the surrounding Arab nations attack Israel in the War of Independence. Can you imagine that? You have not even recovered, hardly, from World War II and being a concentration camp survivor, and now you're having to fight for your life, fight for your land. It's crazy what they have gone through, and then all the anti-Semitism since. The next fact is this, that Israel is the largest immigrant-absorbing nation on earth. So at a time in our world where you hear a lot about immigration, and nobody wants to take immigrants in, Israel is the largest immigrant-absorbing nation in the world. I find that pretty astounding. So again, it confirms what we've talked about, that Israel is very open to other people and taking care of other people. The next fact that I want to share with you is this. The Mount of Olives is the oldest continuous use cemetery in the world. It's over 3,000 years old. Okay? So when you want to go to a place where people have been dead a long time, go to the Mount of Olives and the cemetery there, all right? They've been hanging out there for a long time. Just interesting facts about Israel, all right? The next one is 1 million notes, 1 million are left in the Wailing Wall each year. That's a lot of notes. 1 million. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Wailing Wall, all right, that's the western wall of what remained of the temple in 70 A.D., right? That's where the Jews go to pray. So as you're facing the Wailing Wall, when you go down a series of steps to the Wailing Wall, and then it's divided. And so on the right side is where all the women go. Men and women cannot pray together. And the left side is where all the men go. And then there's a wall on the left side as well. And when you get down to the wall, there's a doorway, there's an opening. And if you go through there, and you can only go through there if you're a man, I've been in there several times, you can go in and you can watch them studying Torah. They have all kinds of books and all kinds of Torah scrolls in there. And so you'll see all of these Jewish men with scrolls unfurled, with books in their hand, and they're studying Torah. All right? But when you get to the wall itself, it's these ancient stones. And of course, you know, where the mortar has come out, there's holes and crevices and everything else. So what people do, the tradition there, is to write your prayer on a little piece of paper, roll it up like a scroll, and then you stick it in the Wailing Wall so that God will remember your prayer. And so that's what they do. So when you go down there, it's just covered, right? And then they go through routinely and they take them all out and they collect them and they put them in a certain place. But 1 million notes a year left in the Wailing Wall. That's pretty astonishing. And then another fact, Israel is the only nation to have ever revived a dead language and made it their national language. So what language is that? Hebrew. Okay, Hebrew is a dead language, right? And they revived it and made it their national language. And then the final just fun fact, if you're trying to figure out how big Israel is, it's half the size of Lake Michigan, all right? So it's a very, very small area. All right, so tonight, for the rest of our time together, we've talked a lot about the political situation, how Israel came into being. We've gone through all of those things. Now we're going to kind of shift a little bit. And tonight I want to talk to you about the Holocaust or the Shoah. Because this historical event that we're going to talk about tonight that occurred in World War II is referred to using two different terms. And I've just given those two terms to you. One of those terms is the way that Jews prefer this event to be referred to as. Pretty much the entire world refers to this event as the Holocaust, but Jews call it the Shoah. And here's the reason. The word Holocaust in German means burning, or it means sacrifice by fire. So it has an offensive connotation to it. So if you're a Holocaust survivor, you don't like the word Holocaust because it means burning. That's the last thing that you want to think of over and over again is your friends, your family members, your relatives burning in the ovens of Auschwitz or Dachau or wherever they might have gone. So to Jewish people, they understand why the term Holocaust is used. In fact, most of the museums of the world are called what? Holocaust museums. All right? Even Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, okay? In fact, this picture that's up right now, this is taken in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, right? And this is an amazing thing. You can go into this dome, and it's just filled with pictures of people that lost their lives during the Holocaust, all right? Even they refer to it so people understand as the Holocaust Museum. That's how they refer to it. But if you really want to win points with a Jewish person, you will refer to it as the Shoah, because Shoah in Hebrew means the catastrophe. The catastrophe, all right? So they prefer that term rather than the German term. It's amazing to think as we talk about the Shoah tonight that we are only 70 years out from that terrible, horrible atrocity, and yet here we are in 2023 in America, and anti-Semitism is out of control. I mean, it is raging at a level that we have not seen since World War II. And by the way, in World War II, we didn't see this kind of anti-Semitism in the United States. It was mostly relegated to Germany and Eastern Europe, right? So think about that. There is more anti-Semitism happening in the United States right now than during World War II, all right? The biggest crime that the United States committed in World War II against the Jews was not anti-Semitism, it was indifference. So think about that. It was indifference. Many of our political leaders, including Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he knew, they had information, they knew what was happening to the Jews, but they chose not to get involved. They chose to ignore it. All right? There's a famous executive order that happened before the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 that was supposed to help Jews come, and it got canceled. It never was acted upon. There were ships that were filled with Jews that came into the harbor in New York City, and the United States turned the ships around and sent them back to their deaths. They refused to take them in. So our crime in World War II was not anti-Semitism, it was indifference. It was not caring about the plight of other people, in this case, specifically the Jews. But my point tonight is this. Isn't it amazing how quickly that people forget history? And isn't it amazing how easily that people will believe a lie? Think of the lies that are being propagated right now in our own United States, on our college campuses, even in our halls of Congress by people, throughout our nation, on our streets in our inner cities where people are protesting. Isn't it amazing how easily people will believe a lie? And that's why the cry, the famous cry, "Never again," is so important. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was about a week and a half or two, maybe a couple weeks ago. The Israeli ambassador was before the entire UN, and he was asking them why they had voted not to acknowledge the acts of Hamas as terrorism. Right? He was upset. They would not decree, they would not come against Hamas. They would not say they were terrorists. They would not acknowledge the act that was committed as evil. And of course, if you know anything about the UN is probably the most corrupt organization in the world. My 2 cents, if I were the president of the United States, I would kick the UN out of the United States, and I would remove all funding, because if the U.S. removed all the funding from the UN would not exist. It's kind of like NATO. If the UN didn't fund NATO, NATO wouldn't exist. right? Because all of those other countries, that's part of the problem. They don't contribute very much, all right? The United States is always carrying the weight, but the UN has become a joke. But anyway, he was sitting before them, and I don't know if you saw the video footage of it or not, but here it is. As he talked to the UN, he was wearing this. Do you see what he's wearing? He's wearing a gold star. But inside the gold star, unlike his forefathers that are pictured on the right, and you can't see it because of that picture, it's not zoomed in. But in Germany, in Eastern Europe, wherever the Jews were brought into ghettos or concentration camps, or after Hitler took over, he made all of the Jews wear a gold star, and it said Jude, Jude, in it, which is German for Jew, all right? So what the ambassador to Israel did was they made these yellow stars, and inside they wrote the words never again. I thought that was brilliant. In fact, I'd actually thought about making up a bunch of them and saying to our congregation, anybody that liked to wear these out in public in support of the Jews against anti-Semitism could do it. And then somebody told me that maybe that's not a good idea unless you want our people to get shot or something like that, I guess. I don't know. But at some point, we have to say never again. It's very sad that we have students testifying. Did anybody see that yesterday? The news coverage of the students, Jewish students that were testifying before Congress because they feel unsafe on their college campuses because of the hatred that's being shown them. So let's take a look at a few pictures. Well, what are they talking about? The kinds of things. So down in the lower left-hand corner, do you see that's a campus building on one of our major Ivy League campuses? And what the students did, the pro-Hamas students, not pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, used a projector and projected this onto the side of the building. It was left up for weeks and weeks. And it says, "Glory to our martyrs." And they're talking about the Hamas terrorists. And this is on a college campus, a major college campus in the United States. Some of the other things, showing Zionism is terrorism. Remember we talked about what Zionism was in week 1? And I defined for you that whole thing. Again, people that don't know what they're talking about, they don't even know what Zionism is. But you can see that protest, Zionism is terrorism. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. More college students, right? Basically, if you're not aware what that phrase from the river to the sea means, is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, wipe out the Jews. All right? It's a very, very offensive slogan. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, on another college campus, where all of the victims that were kidnapped by Hamas, their pictures had been put up to remember them, they were torn down and then a note was left. Okay? These are the kinds of things that have been happening, on our college campuses. And so these students were testifying of having to hide, having to take their Jewish jewelry off, all kinds of stuff like that. It's unthinkable that these things that I'm showing you tonight could actually happen in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? Because you and I know full well that none of that would be allowed on campuses if it were any other group but Jews. If it was Muslims, if it was LGBTQ people, if it was transgender people, if it was, you name it, any other people, there is no way that these college presidents would allow this stuff. But because of it's Jewish people, it's okay. So here's my point. Once again, it shows the double standard and the demonic nature of the attack against Jews. Remember I told you what has happened to Jewish people over the centuries doesn't make sense. There's always a double standard. Jews are not treated the way other people are treated. They haven't been treated that way historically and not treated that way today, as you can see from all of this, right? It's because there is a demonic attack against the Jews because it's through the Jewish people that God chose to bless the world. It's through the Jews that our Messiah, Jesus, came. All right? So the enemy has always been after the Jews. He's always been after the seed, right? From Genesis 3:15. And that's why eventually this will all turn, and it will turn toward Christians. While the majority of Jewish deaths during the Shoah occurred between 1941 and 1945, that was the height of the killing of Jews in the Shoah. What you have to understand is that the persecution of the Jews started much earlier than that. It started in 1933. And does anybody know what major event in Germany happened in 1933 that changed everything? Hitler comes to power. He is elected as the Chancellor of Germany. And does anybody know what Hitler did as soon as he became elected as the Chancellor of Germany? Like any good dictator, what did he do? He not only built an army, he had been building an army since 1923, but he immediately, upon becoming chancellor, killed his opponents. All right? All kinds of things happened in that first 6 months to a year where he got rid of all the voices that were against him. And then he did something else. Upon becoming chancellor, Hitler immediately established what was called the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. What a name. The Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, doesn't it? And does anybody know who headed the Ministry of Propaganda in Germany? A very famous German. Much hated. Joseph Goebbels. And Goebbels became the propagandist for Hitler. And what the Ministry of Propaganda aimed to do was to ensure that the Nazi message was successfully communicated through, get this, art, music, theater, film, books, radio, educational materials, and all of the press. So from an early age, okay, in school, children were taught in Germany to hate Jews. That was one of the first things that Hitler did. He floods all of Germany with all this propaganda against the Jewish people. And in their schools, they begin teaching their children to hate Jews, that Jews are dirty, filthy, subhuman creatures. By the way, it's the same thing Hamas teaches their children in Gaza. And I could show you some videos of that, the videos that children in Gaza are shown in school, that talk to them about how filthy and dirty and horrible the Jewish people are. And so all of these propaganda campaigns were designed to create an atmosphere that promoted violence against Jews. Films in particular played a very important role in disseminating anti-Semitism, the superiority of the German military power, and the intrinsic evil of Jews as enemies defined by Nazi ideology. And so some of the Nazi films, and let me show you a poster of one of those films, okay, portrayed Jews as subhuman creatures that were infiltrating this pure Aryan race and who were dangerous enemies to the German way of life. All right? So in 1940, a film came out called The Eternal Jew. It was directed by Fritz Hippler, and it portrayed Jews as wandering cultural parasites who were consumed by desire for sex and money. So don't let your women get near Jewish men, and don't let your money out of your sight, all right? And so horrible images like this were seen by Germans week after week, month after month, year after year from 1933 on. Newspapers in Germany, like one called Der Stürmer, which means the attacker, printed cartoons that used anti-Semitic characters to depict Jews. The propaganda effort was carefully orchestrated to do what? To brainwash the German people. And I made this comment last week that Hamas has tried to do the same thing to the Palestinians that live in Gaza since they took over, to brainwash them. all right? That's why it's hard to have conversations now for politicians to go in there and try and negotiate, because so many of them that never knew anything different but Hamas, they grew up under Hamas rule, have been brainwashed by Hamas, all right? If journalists in Germany were caught speaking out against the Third Reich in any way, they were imprisoned and they were sent to concentration camps. In fact, in June 1944, the German security police, the SS, permitted an international Red Cross team to inspect the Theresienstadt camp ghetto. Now, this was a ghetto. This was basically a concentration camp, a holding place that the Germans had created. It was located in the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which today is the Czech Republic. And this particular camp, to show you to what great lengths they would go for propaganda, the SS established this camp in November of 1941 as an instrument of propaganda for domestic consumption to the German people. So this camp was used as an explanation for Jews who were puzzled and were asking questions about the deportation of German and Austrian Jews who were elderly, who were disabled war veterans, locally known artists and musicians, to the east for labor, all right? And so they created this propaganda camp. And they would say to their own people, they would take photos and films in this camp, and they would set it up like theater with Jews there that were well-fed and whatever, and they'd say, look at our Jewish brothers are doing just great. And the German people would say, oh, okay, just asking. So in 1944, now most of the leaders of the world, they understand what's happening. They understand, they've heard the stories of how the Jews are being incinerated. And so they send the Red Cross to Germany. And Hitler sends them to this camp in 1944. And before they get there, it undergoes a beautification program. So that in the wake of this inspection, SS officials in the protectorate produced a film using ghetto residents as a demonstration of the benevolent treatment of Jewish residents of this camp. All right? When the film was completed, SS officials deported most of the cast to Auschwitz to be gassed and killed, right? It was a big ruse where they brought the Red Cross through and said, see, we're not mistreating anybody, okay? It does bring up the question, though. One wonders, when you look back, how the Germans could have been so badly fooled by Hitler. And the point is, it shows you the power of propaganda. If people are told something long enough and often enough, they will eventually believe it, and history has proven that to be true. That's why it's so important that we're on our guard in America and what's going out over the airwaves. Because if American people hear something long enough and often enough, they will believe it even though it's a lie, all right? Let me just give you some examples of propaganda campaigns in the United States that have swayed the masses and kind of caused hysteria. How about we start in the 1950s with Senator Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare? Do you remember that? Do you know that Joe McCarthy didn't have the name of one communist? It was all for political gain and showmanship and power. And yet, 73% of Americans during that time believed his propaganda, and many people's lives and many people's careers were ruined because of his propaganda. On September 15th, 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, okay? So we go back to Germany now. We're 1935, 2 years after Hitler becomes chancellor. And the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their German citizenship and all of their rights, including the ability to marry a German. No more mixing of the races. They were completely excluded from German society by the Nuremberg laws. And so the propaganda war stirred Germany into a frenzied pitch that led to a tipping point on November 9th, 1938. Does anybody know what is significant about the date November 9th, 1938? What happened that night in Germany? Does anybody know what the name of that night is called? It's called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And so what happened on Kristallnacht is that Germans had been so propagandized into this feverish pitch and anger and hatred toward the Jews that the Germans literally stormed Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes and broke all the windows and stole all of the merchandise out of their homes and out of their businesses and their property, and then set their homes and set their businesses on fire all in one night. So you had this happening throughout Germany. It's called the Night of Broken Glass. And that very night is the night that they began, when they broke all the glass and they created all this mayhem, they began rounding up Jews, and the first place they took them was to what was called ghettos. Eventually, they would take them from the ghettos to the concentration camps, but the first place they held them were in ghettos. So it was a part of town that had been fenced off and fenced around. Jews were not able to come and go. They weren't able to leave their ghetto. They had to stay in this several block radius area. And so starting in 1938, that's when they began to round up the Jews and put them in ghettos. 30,000 Jews were rounded up on that very first night. Right? Now you think 30,000. Well, remember, there are not that many Jews in the world at that time. All right? And then if you're talking about in a particular country, all right? So 30,000 to be rounded up in one night is a huge number of people. Then later on, they were transported from the ghettos to the concentration camps where they would be killed. But the Nazis created, here's some more pictures. Let me just show you some more pictures so you can see what that night looked like. There is a synagogue going up in flames. All right? Another picture of the aftermath of somebody's home and business in a neighborhood. There's some of the businesses after the night of glass. This one that you can see best on the left-hand side is a jewelry store where the windows were smashed out and all the jewelry was stolen from the store. You can see what the Germans wrote on the store to identify it as a Jewish store. That's significant because if you were marked as a Jewish store on that night, it was your windows that got broken. All right? And then here's what I referred to earlier, the Jewish stars. Now you get a kind of an up-close look at those. And you can see that everyone that was a Jew had to wear that star. Okay, if you were caught out without it, you'd be killed. So here's the thing. The Nazis created over 44,000 incarceration sites. 44,000. That included detention centers, forced labor camps, and killing centers. They functioned, these centers, independent of any judicial or government review. And they operated in torture, starvation, and mass murder. And nobody stopped them, and there was no oversight over these. They were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. And of course, Hitler had secretly given them the go-ahead to kill as many as they could. In January of 1939, a month and a half after Kristallnacht, all Jews were required to wear the yellow Jude star, identifying themselves as Jews. So, the code name that Hitler gave to describe his plan for the Jews was called the final solution, right? And a guy by the name of Reinhard Heydrich was the architect of the final solution. And in the final solution, 6 million Jewish people died during the Holocaust. Nearly a third of them died within the span of 3 months during the killing campaign Operation Reinhard, which was the plan to kill 2 million Jews in Polish concentration camps. So if you can imagine 6 million Jews basically die during the Shoah, during the war, all right? But nearly a third of them, 2 million, are killed within a span of just 3 months. That is a lot of people to kill in a period of 3 months. There were 3 main killing centers that operated between 1942 and 1943, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And during this time period, 1.7 million Jews were killed using carbon monoxide gas, and then they were thrown into ovens. So I'm sure most of you have seen this. Basically what they would do was they would bring them into a big room. They would have these killing centers. They would bring them into a room that was completely empty. And then they would have them take all of their clothes off, all of their jewelry off, and put it in piles. And then as they were standing in there naked, they would release this poisonous gas, all right? And they would kill them. And then along the wall, there were ovens. And so they would literally take them from the floors and just stick them in the ovens and basically cremate them, all right? The gas that was used, the particular type of poisonous gas was called Cyclone B, right? A gas that was outlawed, all right? It's a war crime. You can't use Cyclone B on people, all right? But they did. So in those 3 killing camps that I just mentioned, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, you can see how many people died, right? Those are just 3 of the camps alone, right? In late 1943, camp officials ordered the camps to be dismantled and murdered the remaining prisoners. Does anyone know why the Germans started dismantling the camps? Anybody want to take a guess? Because they were now losing the war. So this really ramps up after D-Day. Because once the Germans have lost the war, in Normandy, they know that their goose is cooked. So now they have to try and backtrack and cover themselves. So basically they try to they want to kill all the evidence. So that means, first of all, kill all the Jews. So that's why you have so many killed in a short period of time. The other thing they try to do is they try to erase everything they can that tells what happened there. But here's where they were not so smart. They videotaped well, it wasn't videotaped back then. They filmed and took pictures of pretty much everything they did. And when the Allies came in, they came in so fast and so swift, the Germans just dropped everything and ran. There was all of this evidence left all over the place, all right? And so you had guys like we'll talk about in a moment, Joseph Mengele, who is this horribly vicious and evil doctor that made it his goal. If you were a twin, you could live, at least for a while, because you were immediately placed in the custody of Joseph Mengele because he's noted for his experiments done on twins. Horrible suffering that twins went through, right? Children that he did horrible experiments on, adults that he did horrible experiments on, okay? At Belzec and Treblinka, the Nazi authorities built a manor house and planted trees and crops to try to disguise the area as a farm, right? And of course, you know that the largest killing center was in Poland. That was Auschwitz. And so by spring of 1943, Auschwitz had 4 gas chambers that were in operation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Has anyone seen the movie, no, well, I'm assuming you've probably seen Schindler's List. No, it was called, it just went out of my head. I think it was called The Boy in the Red Pajamas. Is that what it is? The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, yeah. So the interesting thing about that movie is all of these people that are living around the concentration camp. Again, can you imagine what the city must have smelled like, one, with these ovens going 24/7? And then the other thing is they're releasing, like, you know, if you ever lived by a factory, right? When I graduated from Bible college, the first place I went to was Akron, Ohio. Does anybody know what Akron was famous for in the day? Rubber, tires. And all of that had pretty much shut down when we got there to be youth pastors. A lot of those plants had closed up. But we used to hear stories of the people from the church that every day you could take your hand and you could run them across the windowsills in your house, and they would be black because of the soot and the rubber that got released through the smokestacks. They said it was horrible, horrible. And a lot of people in Akron died of cancer and lung diseases because of all of that. And so the boy in the red pajamas, they do a good job of, here are these Germans are like, what is that smell? And why is, you know, they're literally doing the same thing. They're taking their hands on their windowsills, and if you remember, they're wiping it, and they don't realize it's humans, cremation remains, right? That's coming up in these huge smokestacks. And again, the point I want to make is they kind of just dismiss it and ignore it. Like it's happening right in their backyard, but they're not doing anything about it. And of course, that's just it's a horribly sad movie about this German kid that befriends this kid in the striped pajamas, a Jewish kid that's in the concentration camp. And I won't ruin the end of it for you, but I'll just say bring your tissue, lots of it. But since Auschwitz main camp was a labor camp, arriving Jewish prisoners faced a selection process, right? So when you got to the camp, there was a selection process, and if you were able to work, you went in one line. But however, the majority people, women, children, the disabled, the elderly, went in a different line, and you were sent immediately to the gas chambers, right? If you were a strong man and you were able to work at all, they would work you until you were nothing but skin and bones, and then they would take you over and they would put you in the gas chamber, right? And this is how a lot of the families, when they came off the trains in Auschwitz, you hear these horrifying stories where they were separated as families. They were separated into lines. So again, if you had children or twins, a lot of times they went, if they were twins, they certainly went to Mengele. They went in a certain line. Able-bodied men went in a certain line, and everybody else went in the line that went to an immediate death. At the height of the deportations, an average of 6,000 Jews were being gassed each day at Auschwitz. 6,000 a day. Again, they used a poisonous gas called Cyclone B. 1.1 million Jews died in Auschwitz alone. And then I wanted to show you this. If you ever see this on a Jew, it's a tattoo. It's a number tattoo. The only concentration camp that tattooed their prisoners was Auschwitz. So if you ever meet a Holocaust survivor, and I have met several from Auschwitz, and they will roll up their sleeve and they will show you their tattoo, and that tattoo signifies that they were, the only ones that have it is that they were in Auschwitz, okay? Again, the children that had the best chance of survival in Auschwitz were twins. And next week, I'm going to share an incredible story with you about a set of twins. You're not going to want to miss that. They were used for experiments by Dr. Joseph Mengele. In mid-January 1945, as Soviet forces approached the Auschwitz concentration camp, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz and all of its subcamps. The SS forced nearly 60,000 prisoners to march west from the Auschwitz camp system. So if you've ever heard about the death marches, what was happening was, as the Allies got closer to liberating Auschwitz, the Germans were terrified that they were going to find all of these Jews. They knew they had committed war crimes. And so they packed up all the Jews and they marched them out of the camp and tried to take them to other towns where they could get rid of them, all right? Because the Allies were coming too quickly. So thousands had been killed in the camps before these death marches, and then prisoners were forced to march 30 to 35 miles a day. Now, if someone asked you to march 35 miles a day, you'd probably be hurting, right? Can you imagine if you'd been in a concentration camp for a year or 2 or 3, and you were skin and bones, and now you were asked to march 30 to 35 miles a day. And if you fell behind, you were immediately shot. Not only were you being asked to do that, but you weren't being asked to do that in the summer. You were being asked to do that in cold weather, suffering from starvation, and without any warm clothes on these marches. And so at least 3,000 prisoners died en route to a town called Gliwice alone, and as many as another 15,000 prisoners died during the evacuation marches from Auschwitz and their subcamps. So even to the bitter end, they were killing the Jews, all right? And then if you did make it to either one of these towns, Gliwice or Władysław, the prisoners, the Jews that did make it, they did survive the march, were put on unheated freight trains and transported to concentration camps in Germany. Because remember, where is Auschwitz? That's in Poland, all right? And so they're now sending them back to Germany to try and hide them. So they were sent to Flossenburg, Sachsenhausen, Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and then they sent some of them to Austria as well, because Austria at that time, of course, was ruled by the Germans. The rail journey alone, the train journey, lasted for several days. And so in this train journey, if you've ever seen pictures of this, they were packed into these cattle cars, all right, so that so many were packed in that over the several-day journey, there was not even room for you to lay down, if you can imagine that. You were shoulder to shoulder, face to face. And so along the way, because there was no food, no water, no shelter, no blankets, many of the prisoners died. But when people died, they didn't fall down because they couldn't fall down because they were packed like sardines. So can you imagine the trauma and the horror of having people around you die and they're just stuck in place next to you? I mean, it's some crazy stuff. On January 27th, 1945, the Soviet army finally entered Auschwitz and liberated more than 6,000 prisoners, most of whom were ill and dying. And ultimately, 2/3 of all Jewish people living in Europe during World War II were killed by the Nazi regime. That's a lot of people. By the way, we're focusing on Jews tonight, but scholars estimate that a total of between 15 and 20 million people in total were killed in the camps by the Nazis. So if 6 million were Jews, that means another 14 million people were killed. Who were they? The handicapped, homosexuals, political enemies, or anyone who spoke out against the Third Reich, and gypsies, who Hitler hated as well. Okay? 15 to 20 million people. So Jews were the primary target. That's how it got started. But then as long as you're doing one group, if we're trying to have this pure Aryan race, well, let's get rid of the rest. Let's get rid of all the handicapped people. Let's get rid of all the homosexuals. Let's get rid of all of our enemies. Let's get rid of all the gypsies. Do you see how that stuff starts to spread? So here's the big question. How do we prevent another Shoah? All right? How do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? Because it doesn't take much, and it wouldn't take much for another Shoah to occur in the world. Because right now, you are witnessing before your very eyes the propaganda, the distortion, the lies, and the calls for death that allowed the first Shoah to happen. Think about that. So here are a few things that we need to do. I think the first one is this. It's important that we take time to remember and that we take time to take classes like this and share this information with everybody that we know. The word remember, all right, that is a word that is frequently used in the Bible and with good reason. Why does the Bible use that word so much? Because God knows that we are prone to quickly forget the things that have happened in our lives. Like just think about the Israelites. You know, every time God turns around, they're complaining about something, right? They quickly forgot all of the miracles. But it's not just them, it's us. How many times have you, I know me, have completely forgot everything God has done for me because I've got a new problem now. And so I'm complaining about new because I forget, right? We are very forgetful. And the problem is that when you forget, you set yourself up to repeat history. That's why it's important that we remember the Shoah, that we remember other atrocities of genocide that take place in our world. We have to keep these things before ourselves, before our friends, before the community, before the nation, before the world, before our children, before our grandchildren, and their generation. Because if we don't tell them these stories, then stuff like what's happening now in America is going to get worse, all right? Then there will be another Shoah, all right? The second way that we prevent a Shoah is never underestimate fringe voices. Do you realize that when Hitler started off, he was a fringe voice? He was a crazy guy. He had a few people with him called brown shirts in 1923 when he started. In fact, his first attempt at doing anything is a miserable failure, and he's thrown in prison. And it's while he's in prison that he writes his seminal work, Mein Kampf, right? And in Mein Kampf, Hitler writes about everything that he would go on to do, including the elimination of the Jewish people, their extermination. But everything he said, as he grew more and more popular in Germany, went unchecked and unchallenged. Why? Because people didn't believe him. All right? In 1928, after Adolf Hitler had been leader of the Nazis for 7 years, the Nazis received just 2.6% of the vote in the German general election. And many people dismiss this group called Nazis as this goofy fringe political party, all right? They didn't see them as any kind of legitimate political force or threat. They were just thought they were a collection of fanatics, goofballs. In fact, they laughed at them. They were the butt end of many jokes in 1928. 4 years later, in the general election of 1932, the Nazis are the biggest single political party in Germany with 37% of the vote. And in 1933, Hitler becomes the chancellor, and soon thereafter, the dictator, the Führer of Germany. That happens in 4 years. He goes from joke to dictator in 5. Right? How does that happen? Because people didn't take him seriously. Right? Given the right circumstances, you need to understand anyone can rise to power. That's how ultimately one day the Antichrist will rise to power. So, what was the scenario that would allow a guy like Hitler to rise to power? Well, you had the great economic collapse of Wall Street, right, that threw the world into the Great Depression in 1929. Germans felt that their traditional leaders, those that had been leading them, had failed them because, remember, they lost World War I. And when they lost World War I, the Allies really stuck it to them. They really made them pay, right? And so there was a lot of shame. There was a horrible defeat. Germans did not feel good about themselves. The economy was terrible. Their lifestyle was terrible. And lo and behold comes Hitler. And Hitler says, I'm going to cause Germany to rise from the ashes and we're going to rule again. And so he begins to do things. He begins to tell the people what they want to hear. And so they begin to follow him, right? You say, man, how do things happen that quickly? We've seen the same thing happen in our own nation. You just haven't put two and two together. In a study done by the University of Chicago, they determined this. This is the University of Chicago now, liberal USA. That only 1.7% of the American population was homosexual in the 1990s. Now, what's the famous number that was always thrown out there? 10%. That was a false study done by the Kinsey Report in 1948, saying that 10% of Americans were. University of Chicago said in the 1990s, only 1.7% of the American population was homosexual. Now, here's my point. Look what they've been able to accomplish in 20 to 30 years in America. Now they rule the roost in many ways, right? Why is that? Because they said they were going to do all these things, but people didn't take them seriously. So my point is, when we hear, whether it's people on college campuses, when we hear political pundits, when we hear this or that, and they say, we're going to do this, we had better take them seriously. We had better not dismiss them, because that's what people did with Hitler. And that's what people have done with other rulers. And they, takes me to point 3. Here's point 3. How do you prevent a Shoah? Always assume that people mean what they say. All right? So if you were to go back and read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, which in English means My Struggle, the book he wrote in prison in 1924, it's filled with all kinds of bizarre concepts and ideas. All right? He was clear that if he ever got power, he would exterminate the Jews. But again, there's this tendency to play down what people say. Oh, they don't. How many times have you ever said, oh, they don't really mean that? Right? Always assume that people mean what they say. All right? There was an interview done with a German banker many years after World War II. And this German banker, whose name was Johann Zahn, described his view, his attitude, his feelings in the 1930s concerning this. And he said this. He said, if you take Christianity, for example, the demands of the Bible, the demands of the catechisms, do you know anybody who fulfills the demands of Christianity 100% or even pretends to fulfill them 100%? And I thought the same way about Mein Kampf. These are demands, these are ideas, but nobody thought they would be taken literally. And that was his statement after the war. Since more than 99% of the population in Germany was not Jewish, right? So remember I talked about that 30,000 number and how big that was per capita, because the Jews didn't even represent 1% in the German population. Because it was 99% non-Jewish, it was very easy for Germans to think that Hitler's obsession with the Jews was of no direct concern to them, so they didn't take him seriously. Again, we have to take people seriously, right? In our own nation today, there are a lot of people saying a lot of crazy things. We need to pay attention to them. We need to take them seriously because they mean what they say. They mean what they say, right? The fourth way to prevent the Shoah is to beware that hatred of minorities can become popular policy very easily. So those who have agendas are always looking for scapegoats to blame, to rally people's emotions. This is a trick that political leaders have used for years and years, all right? If you want to rally a crowd, all you need to do is find a common enemy. By the way, church leaders do this too. Throughout history, we've set up some pretty good straw figures to rally our people, whether that was real or not, all right? Because that's the way you do it. In the 50s, I said earlier, it was John McCarthy and the Red Scare. Every person was a communist. In times past, it has been black people. During World War II, it was the Japanese in America who had their businesses and their possessions stolen, and they were placed in camps, determined camps in the U.S. It could be Muslims. Eventually, it will be Christians, right? We have to be cognizant of the fact that hatred of minorities can easily become public policy, right? The fifth way we prevent a Shoah is don't assume that you can predict your behavior in a crisis. And so this is an interesting one. So if I were to ask you, each individually tonight, what would you have done if you were living in Nazi Germany and you had Jewish friends, and then the decree goes out that all Jews are to be turned in? What would you do? I think a lot of us, probably the majority of us in here, would immediately say, I would hide the Jews. I would be like Corrie ten Boom. I would be like a number of other people. I would have hid my Jewish friends. That's because we believe that our character is fixed and unlikely to change according to circumstances. But in studies that have been done, that did not happen with the German people. And the reality is, it would not happen with a lot of us. And here's why. Because if the Germans came to your door and threatened to kill your wife and your children, if you did not give up the Jews that you were hiding, or if you did not tell them that you had Jews, etc., or if they came and said, if you don't shut up, we're going to kill you if you stop speaking out against us, okay? What would most people do if it's my wife and my children? They would save themselves and their family before they would save the Jews. The number of German families that hid Jews was minuscule. Minuscule. Very slim. The majority of Germans turned their neighbors into the German authorities. They didn't even say, well, you know what, I'm just going to be neutral, and if they get found out, they get found out. I'm just going to play dumb. They didn't even do that. They literally turned their neighbors into the German authorities because they feared what the Nazis would do to them and their families. You say, well, that could never happen. That wouldn't happen. COVID. There was billboards in Illinois. Turn your neighbors in. If they're having people over to their house, if they're having a party, if they're not wearing a mask, right? Those billboards were in our state. And you know what the worst part is? People actually called those numbers and turned their neighbors in. And we're not even talking life or death with your family. We're talking about COVID. So this is one of the, when we talk about preventing another Shoah, we kind of have to be honest with ourselves and not assume that we can predict how we would behave in that situation. Our stance as believers has to be, by the grace of God, with the help of God, I would hope and pray that I would do the right thing. Because human nature is a funny thing. We don't always know how we're going to respond until we're in a situation that we never thought we would be in, and our life is threatened. And then we may surprise ourselves or disappoint ourselves, right? And then finally, the sixth thing is this. Close with this tonight. How do we prevent Shoah? We have to speak up. We cannot be silent. And I've said this over and over again. during this class. Why am I teaching you all these things? Why am I giving you, arming you with all this information? So that you can speak up. So that you can tell your children, your grandchildren, your friends, you can speak intelligently about all of these issues. So that when you're at work and you hear somebody saying something dumb, you can say, excuse me, did you know that? And you can actually prove it because it's all a matter of historical record, right? You can speak intelligently to these things. The answer to preventing another Shoah is we have to speak up early. We can't let things go, and we have to speak up often when we start to see things happening like right now, because silence is a killer. Silence allows things to progress. And of course, you've all heard the famous quote from Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor in Germany. And he said this. He said, first they came for the socialists. No, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then one day they came for me, and there was no one left to speak. Right? We can't afford to be silent, or it'll be too late. And that's the thought I want to leave you with tonight. If we do not stand up, if we do not speak out, I can guarantee you 100% that there will be another Shoah. And you are witnessing before your very eyes how easily it could happen. In fact, I told Crystal a number of weeks ago when I started seeing what was happening on the college campuses, and I had already been teaching for years that the college campuses were a hotbed for anti-Semitism. I mean, there's been stuff going on at the college campuses in that arena for years, and professors and all of that. I told Crystal, what I'm waiting for is I'm waiting for Kristallnacht to happen all over again in our inner cities like Chicago, New York, LA, Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta, you name it. I'm waiting for the night that all of these people get themselves into such a frenzied, feverish pitch that they start going after synagogues and Jewish businesses and Jewish homes and breaking out the windows and burning them to the ground. Because I'm telling you, we're not very far from that right now. We are not very far from that right now. And I told Chris, I would not be surprised if that happened. In fact, I've almost been waiting for it to happen when you watch some of the violence and some of the things that are going on, because if we allow it to continue to progress, that will be the ultimate, that's the end game right there. Now we start destroying things. And you say, well, that won't happen. How about during COVID? How about Black Lives Matter? How about all the things that happened? What did they do? They went in, they broke windows, they set things on fire. We already have a precedent in America for that, right? So these things are not beyond, what I'm telling you tonight is not like some fantasy world, like that's never going to happen. We've already seen a lot of these things happen in different forms. So again, if people don't have truth, then the Jews become an easy scapegoat for people's anger. Well, let's just blame it all on the Jews. That's been the line for century after century after century. Right? And that's what we need to understand, and that's what we need to stop. Okay? Next week, in our final class, I have a really special treat for you to conclude this whole class, so don't miss it. I think you're going to really enjoy what we do next week and who we hear from next week. It's going to be amazing. Got a few minutes left. I'd be happy to take any questions. I haven't really taken any questions. I know Pastor Nick did a few weeks ago because he had some time left, but I've been packing so much information into this. I've gone right to the 8 o'clock mark. But just wondering, any questions that you have about what we've talked about tonight or maybe in the class in general that I could try to answer? I do not have all the answers to this stuff, but it has for years and years, especially The show of the Holocaust has been an area of study and interest for me, so I've studied a lot in that area. But any questions or thoughts about what we talked about tonight? I know when we talk about this night, this is like a really heavy night because it's a heavy subject. But again, we can't shy away from this stuff. We kind of have to look it in the face and see it for all of its ugliness. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I will see you this weekend for part 2 of our series, Narnia, A Christmas Journey. And we're going to talk about Turkish delight this Sunday. All right? By the way, I was laughing on Sunday when I was asking people if they see him. And people were looking at me like I was nuts. So, do you see him now? Okay, each week he gets a little closer because remember, Aslan is always present. We just don't always see him because we're not looking for him, right? But I was getting a little frustrated with people. I was saying, they're not getting it. People are looking at me like, what are you talking about? Do I see Jesus? I don't know. All right, have a great week, everybody.